For the remaining part of this lecture, I want to discuss the kinds of people who were living in these tenement districts in the big cities. The immigrant populations that were flooding into the country during this time. As the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty reads, "Send us the refuse of your teeming shore. Send us your waste, send us your leftovers." And indeed, we needed those leftovers, these masses of people, to do the incredible amounts of work that needed to be done in the industry of that era. In the period that we're discussing, the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s, attention began to focus on a group we now call the new immigrants. This is in contrast to those kinds of groups that had been coming in large numbers already. We might call them the old immigrants, those who had been coming before. These would consist largely of English immigrants, the nation from which our own country is in some ways born. The Irish, who came in large numbers in the 1840s and 50s, driven out of Ireland by the potato famine. And the Germans, who had arrived in numbers to several of millions, also in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. By the 1880s, we're starting to see the arrival of new groups, different groups. We had Italian immigrants to the United States before, but in relatively small numbers. By the 1880s, though, what we're beginning to see is the transportation revolution that we witnessed in the United States, and primarily the growth of railroads, is also beginning to penetrate Europe as well. And rail lines are making their way farther and farther into countries like Italy, into Eastern Europe, and even into Russia as well, the farthest reaches of the globe. And shipping as well. We are seeing a revolution in the shipping industry. And particularly as large numbers of immigrants begin coming from Europe and other parts of the world to the United States, the shipping industry begins modifying its ways to speak to that group. And we're beginning to see ticket prices coming down. Gradually, the ships themselves are being transitioned over to house large numbers of immigrants, and so on. In short, it is becoming easier for those who might want to come from these faraway lands to make their way to the United States. It's still not an easy process, but it's becoming easier in this time. And so we start to see these new immigrants coming from places like Italy, Eastern Europe. These would be Hungarians and Polish and so on, and large numbers of Jews coming from Russia during this era. And just as one example in terms of the numbers, the largest decade of immigration in our nation's history is from 1900 to 1910. And what we notice is that the so-called old immigrants are still coming in large numbers. From 1901 to 1910, we have 1.5 million immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and England. But they are overwhelmed by the much larger numbers of these new immigrants, 6.5 million coming from the rest of Europe, and 2 million Italians alone. The process of immigration would have been a very daunting and difficult one for anybody who undertook this great adventure in life. And yet we see that the process gradually becomes more manageable, and we can speak in terms of some general qualities of what this process was like. First of all, for whatever group we are discussing, kinship networks become very important. There began to be in every immigrant group these networks of those who have come before and are already settled. Sometimes this stretched out over generations. And they were able to reach out to the new arrivals just getting off the boat and offer them opportunities, offer them perhaps a place to live, help them find a job, help them get settled, and so on. And so there gradually came to be an entire economy that consisted of what we might call middlemen. These were people in the middle of this process of immigration, sometimes related in terms of kinship, but often not, often simply just representing the ethnic group that was arriving. These would be people waiting at the docks, either to prey upon the newly arrived immigrants. There's an awful lot of scam artists and thieves and pickpockets and so on. But in many other cases, they made a living by introducing people to those who might help them find a job, help them find a home, and so on. The immigrants themselves became part of this national movement towards greater production. And so I don't think any one immigrant would have thought of themselves as sort of a small cog in this much grander machine, but that is in effect what they were. The nation itself is in the midst of a movement towards efficiency and greater production. And so the idea was to take these immigrants and just plug them in to whatever job might lead to the greatest profits and the greatest production for that company. What this means is really an emphasis on unskilled labor rather than skilled labor. We think these days there's so much emphasis on writing a good resume and building a vita and establishing all kinds of experience and skills and marketing yourself in that way to future employers. And you all are going to be doing this as part of your college progression. Imagine if none of that meant anything. And in fact, you would be better marketing yourself to say, I have no skills, no abilities, I am simply a physical being and a body, tell me what to do. That is in effect what these immigrants were asked. If they did have skills, and many of them did, coming from the old country, imagine they had every kind of occupation that we have here in the United States. There were doctors and lawyers and all kinds of trades. And yet when they arrived in the United States, they were asked simply to shovel a pile of coal from one corner to another, or move these parts from here to there, or screw in this one screw on a machine over and over again. And so this leads really to the decline of skilled labor among the immigrants. If you were a cooper, a barrel maker, if you were a baker or something like this, you had to unlearn or forget about those skills because they were of little use in this new economy. Another feature of life for these immigrants was what we know as the family economy. Whenever possible, the women would work along with the men. The children would work as well, doing whatever they could. And so we do have the great prominence of child labor during this time. There are many images of children and wives working from home, working in the tenement buildings. There are many famous images of children rolling cigars and so on. That was something they could do in the home. And so the mantra came to be cooperate and survive. Life was so difficult. There were so many demands put upon them. You simply did whatever you had to do to cooperate and survive. Now, we could talk at great length about any of the distinct ethnic groups who were arriving. I'll mention just a few briefly to give you some examples of these new immigrants. Really, the core group among the new immigrants were the Italians. And there are many tales of Italian immigration during this period. The fact is that most of the Italians who came to the United States during this era intended to return to Italy. And in fact, many of them did. Between 30 and 50% of all Italian immigrants coming to the United States returned to Italy at least once. And many of them made this journey back and forth over and over again. Their intention was to earn some money in the United States and either bring that money back home or send it back home to their families. And so what we see among Italians is something of a slowness to adapt to American ways. because many of them didn't really think of the United States as their home, as their country. They still focused on life back in Italy. And so it's very much a process where it took a generation. It was the next generation of Italians who really adopted the United States as their own. And so we see Italians perhaps slower than other groups to join into the political system of democracy. They were slow to join traditional American political parties. There was also a very high rate of child labor among the Italian groups. And in a city like New York City, you would have seen thousands and thousands of young Italian boys and girls as well working in the city. It becomes almost a cliche to see the Italian paper boys, and you see a picture here of some of those famous paper boys. Fierce competition among them to sell a dozen or so newspapers and make a few cents each day, because there were thousands of them roaming the streets in New York City. Now, when I speak of the Polish, it really represents any of the large numbers of Eastern European immigrants during this time. There's too many different groups to go into detail about Hungarians and Greeks and Arabs and Russians and many others. And so the Polish, in a way, represent all of these groups. Their experience is a little different from the Italians. While some of them did return, it's not a small percentage, as many as a third returned to Poland, but most of the Polish and other Eastern Europeans accepted that they were going to be settling in the United States more permanently. And in fact, we can see this even geographically. If we think about typical Italian immigrants, we think about New York City. It's where the vast majority of the Italian immigrants landed. But if we think about a typical Polish or Eastern European city, and I'll give you a moment to ponder what kind of cities might come to mind. Well, certainly we think of Chicago, right? And hundreds of thousands of Poles wound up in Chicago. You think of the old Saturday Night Live skit about the Bears and the guys gathering around eating their Polish sausage. And other cities as well, like Pittsburgh, or Buffalo, New York, or Milwaukee, or Detroit. These are cities collectively known as the Rust Belt, industrial cities that by the early 20th century had already begun to sort of rust out with the many different factories in that region. But it's kind of a sturdier sort of lifestyle. Most of the Polish wound up in manual labor, the lowest kind of jobs. And there's something of a cliche about the Polish being uneducated or unintelligent. Well, you know, the fact is they spoke a different language, and many of them didn't have that kind of background. So their ability to adapt to life in the United States was perhaps a little bit more challenging. But here are the words of one of the Polish immigrants during this time. "What people from America write to Poland is all bluster. There's not a word of truth. For in America, Poles work like cattle. Where a dog does not want to sit, there the Pole is made to sit. And the poor wretch works because he wants to eat." So life for the Polish immigrants was very difficult during this period as well. The final group we might mention here are Russian Jews. We could say Eastern European Jews as well, but the great majority came from Russia, where after 1880 the Jews suffered great persecution in Russia, and they were confined, huge numbers of Jews confined to a relatively small area where they were all forced to live, known as the Pale of Settlement. And in the Pale of Settlement, while they were mistreated at times and there was religious persecution at times, it was more an issue of overpopulation and incredible competition for jobs that forced many of them to want to leave. As one person described it, it wasn't easy to live with such bitter competition as the congestion of population made inevitable. There were 10 times as many stores as there should have been, 10 times as many tailors, cobblers, barbers, and tinsmiths. And so, as soon as they were able, hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of Jews made their way to the United States. And unlike some of the other groups we've discussed, for the Jews making this incredibly long and difficult journey, there was very rarely any intention to return to their homeland again. Less than 5% of Jews ever returned. They wanted to get out, and once they got out, they knew they were not going back. And so Jews very avidly and rapidly dove into the American system of democracy and capitalism. One of the cliches of this era was the Jewish street corner peddler. And you see the picture here of some of these street corner peddlers selling apples, selling pencils, selling anything they could think of. And in many of these cases, this was the first step on a progression towards success in this country. Some of the street corner peddlers eventually opened their own stores, and down the road launched some of the biggest industries in this country. And we can think of Sears and Roebuck as one example. This company originated with Jewish street corner peddlers, just like the ones you see pictured there. Many of the other Jews found their home in the garment industry. A lot of them were involved in the garment industry back in the old country. And we should not think that this group was any more privileged or well off necessarily than some of the other groups we've talked about. If they did have skills, if they did have education when they arrived, in many cases they had to forget those skills as they were simply put to work in the American system. Here's a description from one Jewish girl who endured this. I had dreamed of free schools, free colleges where I could express my innermost thoughts and feelings to the world. And then this is a paraphrase. And instead, off of the ship, she was driven to the sweatshops where she says, to become a hand, cramped, deadened into a part of the machine. What we are left with on the whole is an incredible amount of ethnic diversity in these cities, and neighborhoods like the one you see pictured here in Chicago. This is around the Halsted Street area in Chicago, where you have literally this rainbow of ethnic groups all living in close proximity to each other. And you can look at the colors for yourself and identify many of the different groups. The dark blue towards the top are Italian. The orange sort of scattered throughout is Russian, and many of those would be Russian Jews. You see some pockets of kind of lighter blue or greenish blue. Those are Irish, and so on. You can look at the different groups. But it led to what we talked about in earlier portions of this slide, these kind of pockets of ethnic identity, and in some cases ethnic rivalry, where the different gangs would clash with each other as they walked the streets. And this became a great problem in these immigrant districts. And so we are left with this kind of dual identity or dual image of immigrants in this country. I think you've all heard the cliche or the saying that we are a nation of immigrants, and we needed the immigrants to do much of the work, perhaps that other people didn't want to do, but it simply needed to be done. And yet at the same time, we had many issues with the immigrants arriving, and in some cases, the same immigrant groups had issues with newer arrivals. There are many kind of notorious clashes, particularly between the Irish, who had arrived a few decades earlier and gotten settled, and then the Irish who were just getting off the boat. And so we're left with this, again, kind of mixed identity or mixed view of immigrants as we see in this cartoon. Here we have Uncle Sam kind of guarding the gates of the country, the gates with the Capitol building in the background. And it says, United States of America. admittance free, walk in, welcome. And again, this is the image of the Statue of Liberty and this nation of immigrants. And yet, what is Uncle Sam doing? Well, he's kind of holding his nose, right? He doesn't want this new arrival coming in. He's glaring down at him. And the immigrant himself, drawn not only in all kinds of stereotypical fashion, but labeled with all kinds of issues that were associated with the immigrants. Poverty, disease, Sabbath desecration, anarchy, superstition, and so on. He's coming in, and this view would have been held by many people in the country. He's coming in to become a burden upon society, to bring these ills and these things that are going to drag us down, rather than to contribute to society and to do the work that needed to be done and to bring this kind of diversity and cultural diversity to the country. In the next chapter, we're going to see that by the 1890s and early 1900s, our views of immigrants and those on the lower end of the economic scale began to shift somewhat, and we began to see an interest in improving their plight in a period of our history that is known as the Progressive Era.